I'm going to play a game called Antony and Cleopatra. It's from Hollandspiele games, and I like the niche that Hollandspiele fills on my game table. They're smaller, simpler without being simplistic, faster to play, kind of get a game in an evening, play it again when you figure out what you did wrong and want to do it better. And they're a nice counterpoint to some of the giant, complex monster games I kind of tend to gravitate towards. But it's a good change of pace. Let me sort of clear my head after something really immersive. It's a fairly small package. A map here with some large format hexes. One half sheet of large size counters. These little cards aren't really cards per se. They're kind of control markers. Indicates who has control of an area of the map. Of course, a die. One player aid card, full color, four pages. Lots of charts and tables on it. And then two player cards to keep track of forces and replacements and things like that. Now, this is a civil war essentially between the Romans, so there's a Western player representing Rome, and that would be Octavian. An Eastern player centered in Alexandria, and that would be Antony and Cleopatra. And there's one rule book, very small, 11 pages, so it's not a complex game, but there are a number of things going on in here that will keep your attention. Now this is manufactured by Blue Panther Games, and I have a few from them, from different publishers. This is the first time that I've experienced a poison gas attack when I opened the box. There was a really powerful fumes that came off of it. And I've had this for a couple of months, but I had to open it and air it out for probably a good 3 weeks before I could stand to be in the same room with it. Just something in the printing process was really noxious. Needed to be aired out. Another thing is that occasionally you can have slight imperfections in the counters in this printing process. There's just a few here that have a few marks on them, but largely it doesn't get in the way of gameplay or enjoyment. Now the red is for the Western player, the blue is for the East. These pale sort of beige are, well, these are some markers, but these are non-player controlled forces here, essentially representing the enemies outside the empire that see an opportunity to take advantage of the strife and prey upon some weaknesses. So you'll have game-controlled forces from the Illyrians, Parthians, and even pirates that can get in the way and disrupt one player or the other. Here's a look at the map, 22 by 34. Basically covers the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, Rome to the west there, and Alexandria down here to the east. And this is the area that you're going to be contesting. And there are divisions that are referred to as provinces, though they're not specifically geographic or political provinces that existed at the time. It's just a convenience for organizing the map. But moving your forces and gaining control of those areas will be part of your job as you fight your civil war. This is a representative opening setup for the game. For the most part, the starting positions are prescribed by the game. The blue player, the Eastern player, has a little bit of flexibility. They can choose to start their army forward in Athens or back a little bit in Ephesus there. And there's also a fleet that can either start in Alexandria or forward in Antiochia. But that's really it. The rest of the positions are more or less fixed. Now, the province cards, those little cards right there, represent control. And each side starts out with their set from the beginning. but I find it a little difficult to get a grasp of who controls what with just those cards. They're good for keeping track of resources later in the game, but watching and keeping track of who controls what was a little difficult, so I took these chits, these are not part of the game, and just threw them all in the provinces, blue and red for each side. And that helps me get a visual, concept of who controls what, especially as the game progresses and things start to change. Every game is ultimately about something. I would say this game is about prestige. If I were writing the rule book, I would put prestige right near the front because it is the cross-cutting concern that underlies all of the activities you're going to undertake. Now what is prestige? It's just a number kept track of here. Both sides start out with 27. The object of the game is to drive your opponent's prestige down while maintaining yours higher, and therefore win the right to rule Rome. Geography doesn't really matter that much. You can't capture territory by occupying it. You really only have one point in the game when it matters, and that is at the very end. If there's no clear-cut winner, and that is determined by driving an opponent's prestige to 0, whoever has a higher prestige and then occupation of the opponent's capital is determined to be the winner. But otherwise, whatever small advantages you can gain from terrain for combat purposes is the only geographical objectives you would have. There are two ways to affect prestige. That's elimination of enemy combat units, or your own, and victory in battle. So you eliminate combat units by fighting battles, or through attrition, or through the most powerful mechanism, and that is defection. When one side is driven down in prestige and the other side is above them by a sufficient margin, that dominant side is able to make defection attempts. They can make it against their opponent's forces or against their opponent's provinces. Now, when a force is defecting, it doesn't come to fight to your side. It just is eliminated, and those losses are treated as prestige losses as well. If you get a province to defect, the advantage is that you gain access to the resources, and those resources are used later, kind of in the mid-game on, to rebuild replacements to keep your army fighting. So that war of attrition can slip to your side if you're able to gain possession of provinces through defection. Again, conquering provinces with your armies doesn't bring them to your side, only through defection. For combat, the CRT is odds-based, but the results are percentage-based. So if you have a very small battle, say 1 unit against 1 unit, that's a 1-to-1 odds, and the percentage results are going to be very hard to achieve to actually eliminate one or the other unit. It has to have a very high percentage result. So small battles rarely yield any kind of outcome that affects prestige. So you're kind of encouraged to have large battles. The more units you have involved, the more the percentages will affect it, and therefore you'll have more prestige gains and losses. I say gains because you also earn prestige by winning a battle. Winning is defined as being able to capture a hex, basically clearing out your opponent. And again, if you have a very small battle, you gain no prestige. If you have a sort of a medium-sized battle with just a few units, you can gain 1 point of prestige. In a large battle, you can gain 2 points for victory. So the game, the CRT, is sort of pushing you towards a large battle to inflict many prestige losses on your opponent while gaining a couple for yourself. That will create the spread between your side and your opponent to allow you to then start making the really killer blow of defection attempts. Movement is pretty simple. You've got different kinds of forces. You have land units, which are your legions and your cavalry. You have naval units, which are squadrons, as well as transports. Each of them has a movement allowance and then an area in which they can move. So land units can only move along coast or all land hexes. Squadrons can only move along coast hexes. Transports can move coast hexes, but also they can move into open sea. If they do that, they have to roll on a table to determine if they've encountered any hazards, whether or not they can complete their trip. They all have their own movement allowances, 3 for land, 6 for squadrons and leaders, and 9 for transports. So transports can be great for moving a force much farther than they can march across land in a quicker time. But again, they're also good for moving across bodies of water. For instance, these legions here in Asia can't get across into Greece without the help of a transport. Since squadrons are limited to coastlines, you basically only have the rim, the outline of the sea, in order to move along. And because the units can't occupy the same space as enemies, you can set up blocking positions to try to hem in your opponent's navy. That can be a decent way to try to gain an upper hand, especially in a combat, where you can cut off their retreat. Combat's pretty simple as well. There's 2 types, naval and land. For the most part, they're fought separately, although you can contribute land units to a naval combat at a certain ratio. But the combat results are determined by totaling up all of the strength points in a hex against a defending hex, creating an odds ratio, then rolling a 1d6. Now, if you don't like the way it looks, the way it's shaping up as a defender, think you're going to get your head handed to you, you can just attempt a retreat before combat. Anything 1 to 4 on a 1d6, and you can retreat and avoid the combat. Now, it's not a guaranteed thing. Every unit in a hex has to roll. So sometimes you can roll, retreat, and then leave someone behind, sort of a rear guard, but essentially that means they're going to get crushed. The game demands that both players be as power mad as their historical counterparts. If you're not aggressive, you're not going to win. There's no such thing as eking out a win on victory points on the final turn. Taking a capital is no sure thing. It can be actually very difficult if you've been in a lot of battles and a lot of attrition has taken place. But each side has different options for when and how to be aggressive. The Eastern player, Antony, starts out in a very good forward position here. He's in Greece. The Western player is actually sort of diffusely deployed and far back. But the problem is that Antony has no one to fight. So he has to be patient. If he overextends, he can open himself up to some easy attacks by Octavian. Again, if Octavian is too aggressive and gets to Greece too early to try to take on Antony, well, he'll be too weak and potentially lose some early battles. But being patient, maybe trying to maneuver your opponent into attacking when they don't really want to. Also, playing the resource game isn't so bad. If you can gain forces in your opponent's provinces by the middle of the second year, 31, when the resource and replacement system starts to kick in, you can deny them resources while keeping your own. You can start to win that little bit of a battle of attrition, possibly give yourself a decent advantage in a combat. And then potentially, once you get the spread of prestige, the defection attempts begin and the game kind of draws to its conclusion when it becomes inevitable that someone will take such a commanding lead that they won't be able to be overtaken. Spreading out forces to conquer territories is generally kind of pointless. No reason to march to the far east there for the Western player, nothing to be had. You can play a few games with some of the close-in territories to try to deny resources, but it's really so easy to defeat that strategy that it's not often to your advantage. Concentrating for the giant battles and hoping for good die rolls ends up being kind of the surest way to win. And there are a couple of small bits to the game that provide a bit of color. and a little bit of decision for one side or the other. One of them is the off-map garrisons for the Western player. You have to maintain the rest of the Republic off-map. And you have 8 experienced legions sitting off-map. And as long as all is well, you get 2 resource points for those off-map provinces, territories. Now, as you start to take losses, experienced legions cannot be rebuilt with replacements. But the Western, so when the Eastern player loses an experienced legion, they're gone. But the Western player can basically call back a legion from off-map, drawing down forces. Every time they do that, they do have to spend resources, but they get a full experienced legion with its combat advantages. But that comes at a potential cost. Drawing down means you're now at risk of troubles. You roll on a trouble table, and if you experience a trouble, you flip one of these markers. And that costs you 1 point of prestige, but it also costs you that resource point. Now there's a mechanism for conducting combat off-map to, put down that rebellion, in which case it would flip back, and then you would have that resource at your disposal again. That's kind of the churn every turn. You can draw in an off-map garrison, but then you have to roll on the trouble and off-map combat table to determine whether or not those resources will be at your disposal. So you can lose 2 resource points, but that's a pretty small cost considering you're gaining a very powerful legion to come fight for you. Another bit of color are the unit types. The black dot means an experienced legion. This is an inexperienced legion. The white means auxiliary, and of course the horse is cavalry. Now, for the most part, these things all work the same. These are worth 1 strength point in combat. Experience is worth 2. So you get sort of an extra point for the dot. If you lose experienced legions in combat, they're gone, except the Western player can pull them off map from their garrisons to replenish their forces. These others can be rebuilt with resource points as replacements. But because they're identical combat values, the only difference is the cost. So an inexperienced legion costs 8 resource points, 6 for either of these. So basically you're always going to be building auxiliaries or cavalry. The only time you're going to build an inexperienced legion is when you have nothing else to build. So yeah, I've got all these different unit types, but they don't add a whole lot in terms of what their capabilities are. It's just resource point costs. Now on the flip side, the heavy black squadron versus light squadron does have a little bit of a difference. Mainly if you have a large stack of heavy against light, of course they wouldn't be fighting each other. Fighting a red player, you actually inflict more damage on a light squadron if you have mainly, or I think up to 4 heavy squadrons in a combat. So that can be a quantitative difference in terms of choosing where and when to deploy heavy versus light squadrons. So only minor choices given the player with these, which were the cheaper ones to build with replacements and when to fight with your heavy versus light squadrons. Each turn starts with a random events phase. There are 2 kinds of random events: storms, which can sink fleet units, and external invasions, which are non-player controlled forces that can impact one side or the other. Now, neither of these things are very likely to occur. Storms especially only have a slightly improved chance of occurring in winter turns. So you have to roll the dice every turn for no outcome. But should a storm arise, it can be really devastating. It can destroy quite a number of fleet units and really tip the balance of power on the naval side, in one die roll. And this bit of color is more interesting than impactful. Now, the idea that you could have these non-player controlled forces enter the game and potentially upset the balance is intriguing, but it's also extraordinarily rare. Both sides have to be at low prestige, and then you have to roll on a random event table to even have the possibility of the event, and then roll on another table to see what, if anything, happens. Now, if the random event occurs, and if one of the invasions occur on the revenge table, these counters come into play in one of two places. If the Illyrians attack, they're placed here, approximately those positions, pirates and infantry. Well, the pirates would block passage along the coastline there. The infantry could possibly block infantry forces marching that way. Pretty easy just to trace along this area here and use your transports to move across the strait. So this is kind of a who cares. The Parthians, at least, if they enter here, they can potentially occupy that province. I believe that would count as enemy occupation, therefore deny the resources to the eastern player. So you wouldn't want to try to counter them, potentially commit forces to attack them and drive them out. Parthians were a pretty tough bunch, so they have 4 strength points and 1 counter. So you'd have to put a very large force to eject them and defeat them. So they do have a bit of an effect in that they could deny you resource points, I think. But then, can I counteract that just by putting somebody in here? Just 1 legion? Hell, I think I can even put a transport. And there, I have someone on my side in that province, therefore I retain those resource points. So I haven't found these to be very impactful at all. Again, they're more interesting than anything else, and they happen so rarely. And actually, in the course of the games I've played, only had 1 revenge invasion, the Parthians right there. So, for the most part, the game plays pretty quickly. You have really just a small number of forces. The nature of the beast makes you want to concentrate them and contest in fairly specific areas. The map, though a big piece of paper, really only has some small play area to it. Especially there are areas up in the far northeast that you really have no purpose of ever going into them. Nothing to fight over there, so things kind of stay concentrated in a certain area. A game of this size, it benefits from having consequential decisions and actions on every turn. For the most part, that's the case. There are only a couple of small things I think kind of slow it down a little bit. Bits of chrome that don't necessarily contribute every turn and just require you to remember to do them without really having an effect. On the whole, it was a very satisfactory game to me. It kind of fits that niche on my table. It's not going to, occupy the table for long periods of time, but when it's there, it can be played repeatedly and get just enough of variation in outcomes to make it interesting and worth trying to solve the little puzzles that it presents you.